do with Marsh.
Nice.
Yeah.
He still does.
Based it,
And I was
part of the
still
team
with
that was responsible for the property risk program.
Sure. So who are you dealing with?
Rod Robinson.
Yeah. Ronnie. Martin as well. Martin Sinclair. He's looking after the account now. So.
No, it was quite a while ago.
Sure. Right.
Five.
So I think
Okay, great.
Cross-train me and
That might be we might have been contracted in, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't know the name, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now I've been in Marsh like 7 years, but I've been in a different. I'm in a different space from let's say from the property lines.
So Mike's Trent's doing insurance program up to me as well.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So
So
I'm
are you going forward?
yeah. So I've been dealing mainly with Jandy.
Yeah, Jamie's great.
So I kind of supervised it all, kind of did some of it last year.
Great.
Mike's hoping that this coming.
Be doing some more. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Oh, it's good to meet you, because I'm sure I think we'll be doing some more cyber. Jenny definitely wants me to break in and do some more cyber stuff.
Yes, no, definitely, yeah. It was a bit disappointing.
Yeah, I really wanted. I think I'll go over it today, but I think probably needs a bit more pre-work done before just applying the policy.
And it's important to everything too.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
From Rutherford. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing from Rutherford.
Yeah.
My colleague.
Mr. Frost. Yeah, mate.
50 minutes,
That's all familiar, mate.
Good to see you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How are you?
Good, thanks, mate. Yeah, good.
Come here, word.
Come on. Come here, hit me, eh? Front row as well.
Oh, good. Pretty busy.
As always. Yeah,
Good.
under control, but yeah, steady.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Did you see something by your
Hi.
health
Morning.
or- You are. Yeah, I saw Grant 3 or 4 weeks ago. I was about to see you guys about.
Your furniture's destroyed the video.
Yes, and she plays.
We like to leave a lasting
Yes,
impression.
really good dealing for us.
Yeah, I think he's getting his arms around the role really
Do you want me to do
well.
that?
Yeah, it's been there for a few years.
Yeah, 3 or 4
I think I've dealt with him more as a client than
Yeah, that seems like all.
because I'm just to be a master for a little bit. And, yeah, didn't cross paths too much with him.
Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Satyamitra Ashok, Executive Officer at RiskNZ, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our November Lunchtime Seminar. Our Lunchtime Seminars run on the first Tuesday of most months, and they remain one of RiskNZ's most popular events. Today's seminar will be our last one for 2019. I would like to thank and acknowledge the support of RiskNZ's partners who make our events possible. Our Premier and Platinum partners, Marsh, SAI Global, and Paladin. Our key Lunchtime Seminar partners, Cybercraft and Safety Associates. Our Lunchtime Seminar supporters, all our venues across the country, including KPMG in Wellington, Watercare and Navigators in Auckland, Christchurch City Council in Christchurch, and Powerco in New Plymouth. RiskNZ's lunchtime seminars are delivered across 4 venues. That's Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and New Plymouth, and connects many more participants through the webinar platform. We've had an unfortunate gas leakage in Wellington, which means our venue there could not host this lunchtime seminar today, but we've had everyone connect through the webinar link, and our apologies for any inconvenience caused. I ask that all venues and participants keep their microphones on mute, but please feel free to type your questions straight into the webinar platform anytime during the session. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And during question time, we will start with the remote participants, then move on to our venues, which is Christchurch, New Plymouth, and then return to Auckland, which is the speaker's venue for this seminar. We will not be opening up audio anytime, so please type your questions directly into the webinar platform. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Jono Su, Head of the Cyber Specialty at Marsh New Zealand. As Head of Cyber Specialty at Marsh, Jono provides specialist risk advice to clients to address their key cyber exposures. He has strong relationships with a range of local insurance carriers and works closely with them to continuously develop enhanced offerings for Marsh clients. Jono regularly contributes to developing thought leadership material to educate both clients and colleagues to better understand cyber risk. Today, Jono will be setting the record straight on cyber risk and insurance. Welcome, Jono. Over to you.
Thank you, Satya. Kia ora, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me here today at RiskNZ. So Satya said, my name is Jono Su, and I'm the Head of Cyber Specialty at Marsh New Zealand. So yeah, I'm based in the Auckland office, but do travel frequently around the country to visit both clients and colleagues and spread the good word about everything in cyber. So by extension, I'm also part of the larger Marsh Pacific cyber team. So I do work directly with 5 colleagues in Australia pretty much on a daily basis. So I've got a good direct line overseas and by extension to the wider global Marsh network. So it's really good having a team to tap into for what's a pretty rapidly evolving space. So day to day, we live and breathe all things cyber, risk and insurance. And what I intend to share with you all today are really some insights into what's going on into this pretty crazy space and how you can better navigate your organization and how you can best prepare really for the next decade of the 21st century. So we'll split today's session into 4 parts. I'll firstly provide some context of the technologies now shaping the world and really what it means for modern cyber risk. I'll then discuss how you can get to know your own cyber risk a lot better by using a framework that we've developed at Marsh. Thirdly, I'll spend some time talking about cyber insurance and debunk some myths and some common misconceptions really on how, what's covered and how it responds to a cyber event. Lastly, I'll go over some practical steps that you can take away after the session to really beef up your level of cyber maturity going forward. So I'll aim to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. And again, we'll take questions all in one go at the very end. So what's the state of the world in right now? Don't answer that, it's usually pretty depressing. Anyway, we're heading into the year 2020, which is incredibly less than 2 months away now. This year's just flown by as always. So it's quite hard to believe it's been almost 20 years since Y2K was meant to happen. Nevertheless, we're living through some pretty challenging times right now. So before I really jump into today's session, I just want to quickly give you some perspective on how far technology has come. So I'm a child of the 90s, and no, that's not intended to make anybody feel old right now. In fact, here's a photo of me as a kid. Or it could be, but really I just Googled Asian baby on a computer. That's what came up. So I grew up using Windows 95 on a computer that looked just like that, if you guys can remember. And I didn't get an internet connection until about 1997. And yes, that dial-up ringtone is definitely well ingrained into my memory. This is my first phone as well. I think everyone can remember the indestructible Nokia brick, in which killing time meant playing Snake and not endlessly scrolling through Instagram. So fast forward 20 years, and this is where we're at now. Pretty different world. So I believe in order to really understand the nature of modern cyber risk, it's important to take stock of the world that we now live in. So 5G is on the horizon, making us more connected, but potentially even more divided as a global civilization than ever before. Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon are worth $3 trillion combined, showing just how valuable data is in the modern economy. And I haven't even factored in Netflix into that. Hackers have the power to bring entire countries and cities to their knees within seconds, making them just as dangerous as specialized military forces. And by next year, we are estimated to have about 50 billion connected devices on Earth. So that's more than 5 devices for every single person on the planet, including children, and a huge playground for hackers to spend their days in. So I guess what this shows, if anything, is that anything is now really within the realms of possibility in this hyper-connected world. And yes, sometimes it does feel like human history is going off on a bit of a strange tangent. But yeah, hyperconnectivity essentially means that the traditional physics of risk just simply don't apply anymore. What that means is that a catastrophic cyber event on one side of the world has the ability to affect people, businesses, and societies thousands of miles away within a couple of seconds. So just let that sink in for a bit. Now that I've provided you some context of the overall technological landscape, I just want to touch upon some key cyber risk trends, which are relevant to New Zealand business going forward. So firstly, we need to start thinking beyond cyber risk. It's just privacy issues and data breaches, because it's become so much more than that now. So obviously we've seen in the last few years how aggressive malware, usually in the form of ransomware these days, can grind businesses to a complete halt. Back in 2017, the world was introduced to 2 particularly nasty strands of malware. So ransomware called WannaCry and NotPetya. I think everyone can remember those, making the headlines quite a bit. So one of the big high-profile victims that I'll touch on quite quickly of these attacks was Maersk, the global shipping line. So they suffered a worldwide outage to their operations, all because a single Maersk port in the Ukraine was hit first with the ransomware. And really, it was allegedly a state-sponsored attack from Russia on the Ukraine, and Maersk is really just collateral damage to that. So this spread throughout the, obviously the Marsh global network within a couple of minutes, and that turned entire container inventory lists completely unreadable, and hundreds of ships were therefore stuck out in the water for a few days. Interestingly enough, no data was actually stolen in this incident, but it did take Maersk more than a week to get back to even basic levels of functionality, and a few months to get back to pre-incident levels. So in other words, what we're seeing is that we're now living in a time in which a cyber event can clearly impact and disrupt your business without your data having to be compromised. So suffice to say, no industry now is exempt from being in the crosshairs of a cyber attack. What we are seeing, however, industries such as healthcare, financial institutions, airlines, and retail. I just want to add to that education now at the top end of the target list. So this is primarily due to the type of information and the huge customer databases that are on hand in these industries. And you really don't have to stretch your imagination too far to think what someone can do with stolen passport details, stolen credit card details, or particularly even knowledge of a private operation that you might have just had. So in saying that, this absolutely does not mean that you can get too complacent if your business falls outside these top industries. Regardless of where you operate, it just pays to think and spend some time thinking about what the worst someone could do with the data that you have. So let's be honest, everyone, we're pretty laid back, even at the worst of times as a country. I think it's one of our most endearing qualities as a nation, whether it's for better or for worse. We used to take comfort that our distance from the rest of the world gave us automatic protection, that really all the horrors of the world just simply couldn't happen here. The internet has unfortunately taken that safety and that geographic isolation away. So unfortunately, it's a pretense that we just can't hide behind any longer. So we've seen in recent months some big name New Zealand brands making their headlines from cyber incidents, and unfortunately the frequency of that is just not going to be slowing down going forward. So in saying that, we're now seeing some promising signs that people are taking it quite seriously. It's really good turnout today on such a nice day outside as well. Granted, I think we still have a bit of a journey ahead of us as a country, so I guess we just can't change that shield right attitude overnight. We do also have the upcoming privacy bill, which is set to pass early next year in government. And so that's been talked about quite a lot in the industry as potentially the next health and safety risk is a hot topic. So I'm sure everyone's really glad to hear that. In other words, knowing these changes going forward from a legislative landscape, it's good to start preparing now, knowing what changes really lie ahead. So that's the world that we live in, exciting, full of opportunity, but slightly daunting at the same time. Keeping up with change in today's world is obviously challenging, so having some tools to better understand what's going on can make your life all that bit easier. So that brings me to our next section, knowing your cyber risk. So this is a framework that we've developed at Marsh, which we used to work with our clients to understand, measure, and manage their cyber risk. So it's really good, not only for us to gain some insights as their broker, but just in general for our clients to really uncover some grey areas about their own business and really how they can address them accordingly. So it's not overly complicated, which is intentionally designed to be, so that you can engage with this framework as easily as possible. So again, that's understand, measure, and manage. There's only 3 pillars, so it's pretty hard to get lost amongst it. So I'll take you through them step by step. So first, get off the rank, understand your risk. And I can't emphasize enough how easy it is to actually understand cyber risk without actually having any technical, IT or cybersecurity speak. You don't need to know how to code. I don't know how to code, and if I can understand it, anyone can. So your IT team, of course, will contribute to you, helping understand about 20–30% of the risk, really in terms of the network perimeter and the security protocols that you have. But of course, the remaining 70–80% of that is a wider business risk, and it can be treated and understood just like any other type of business risk. So I just really want to emphasize that it's not just IT's problem anymore, it's a business problem. So what does that really mean? Once you take all the technical jargon out of it, it's actually quite simple. So firstly, know your exposures from a cyber perspective. Ask yourself the questions, do you store a wealth of confidential information? Would you be severely impacted if your networks were down for a set amount of time? And how quickly can you recover from it? Do you have critical vendors in your networks that your supply chain that you rely on to operate on a day-to-day basis? So really just start asking yourself these questions. And again, these are very high-level concepts that anyone can understand. You don't need to delve down to those IT, coding details or anything like that. So secondly, brainstorm scenarios which might give rise to cyber loss and the ramifications of it. So this can mean running a scenario or having a sit-down workshop to identify particular scenarios in which, say, 90% of your customer database has been compromised, and of course identifying all the fallout and all the subsequent costs that might occur from it. Or potentially even a ransomware scenario, like I mentioned before, in which all your employee devices have essentially been turned into nice expensive bricks. So really just start asking yourselves the questions, what's the worst that someone could do with the data that you have on hand, or how your day-to-day operations could really be affected by a cyber event, no matter what they would be. So yeah, just take some time to understand what could go wrong from a cyber attack. Don't get too bogged down in the technicalities. And of course, it's just easier to focus on the potential consequences. So now that brings me to our second pillar, measuring your risk. So now that you've understood where your potential exposures may lie and which scenarios could cause some significant loss to you, it's now time to really quantify it. So in general, there's still a lack of data publicly available, even just in the industry, readily available to accurately quantify cyber loss. And that's just really due to the adolescence of the market and the adolescence of the risk. It's, I guess, slightly more difficult to quantify than traditional fire and general risk, or how much a building would cost if it was burnt down from a blowtorch. Luckily, we have an analytics team here at Marsh, so colleagues who are far smarter than me, who can carry out loss modelling on any organisation, really, in any industry, to accurately put a dollar figure on how much the loss could occur. That can range from a 1 to 2 scenario to a 1 in 200 event type of scenario. So there's a bit of a range, but it can really show you the worst case scenario and how much that can cost you. So how does that work? They essentially ask for a data set. So they'll generally look at a number of, the amount of critical records that you could be on the line for, that you could potentially lose, and of course the cost to notify affected individuals and recover from any stolen data. So that can often cost a lot depending on the severity of it. They'll also look at your loss from a network interruption perspective, as in how much you could lose from your systems being offline for a set amount of time, as well as the associated recovery costs again. So again, without getting into the technicalities of the loss modelling process, measuring the potential loss to your business can absolutely be carried out these days. So now that you've identified and quantified your cyber risk, it's time to figure out what to do with all that fresh knowledge. So certainly you can use that assessment to fine-tune your internal risk management processes first and foremost, to address those certain exposures or things that need to be obviously beefed up. If, for example, invoice fraud has been identified as a massive concern, or an area where there's really loose protocols at the moment, you might want to start implementing robust second checks or third or fourth checks, and of course bank account verification processes. And this could of course minimize that that risk or that event from happening altogether, which is always better than recovery. And something like that scenario, if you do have those processes in place, it's pretty hard for hackers to get around. Second point, of course, you always have the option to transfer some or most of your risk over to a cyber insurance policy. And yes, of course, there was going to be an insurance part of this. In other words, by understanding and measuring your risks, you can start designing a program to fit accordingly. And so you're not just guessing anymore, throwing the dart at a dartboard to figure out how much limit you should buy. There's going to be a lot of science behind it. So you've got full assurance that what you're buying is actually fit for purpose. So again, we do recommend speaking to your broker about all this. And if they don't know what to do, then you can get a business card from me after the session. So speaking of insurance, I've conveniently placed this whole section here now to go over. So I'll really just want to discuss what it covers, how it's designed to respond to a cyber event, and really just demonstrate the value of having a cyber insurance policy to support your organization. So I'll start with the basics. What is cyber insurance? In a nutshell, cyber insurance responds to a cyber event. It's nice and simple, and it is, again, fit for purpose. There's no ambiguity here and no reliance on trying to get another type of insurance policy, such as your material damage and business interruption policy, property policies, professional indemnity, to cover some of the losses from a cyber event. Again, they're not specifically geared to respond to cyber events, and you're going to have to put a lot of claims work in to try and get some of those other policies to respond. So cyber insurance is designed, again, pure and simply to respond to cyber events and all the fallout from it. And there's a lot of specific things and unique things in cyber policies which other policies just don't have. So here's a snapshot. I don't know if you guys can see that from back there. So I'll go over them really quickly anyway. So in blue on the right side of the screen, we have common first-party coverages to protect you from from significant financial loss and of course out-of-pocket expenses. So at a high level, that's business interruption from a cyber event, and again, your traditional business interruption policies will not respond to cyber events. It's just not under that scope. So there's business interruption again, specifically for a cyber incident. Of course, under that, you've got data recovery and restoration costs, extortion coverage. So that's really for ransomware or any other types of cyber extortion. And a really valuable one at the end, the immediate incident response costs. So that is, again, a unique part of cyber policies, which are not in any other sort of traditional insurance policies. So in green on the left side at the bottom, these are the third-party coverages. So they're broadly designed to respond to any liability claims which might arise or regulatory action which might come up from a cyber event. So I'll work through these coverages in the next few slides with some context of a hypothetical scenario to best demonstrate how it fits all together. So please note that this diagram, again, is not the be-all and end-all of cyber coverage. There's a lot of things that can go in and out of policies, but just to keep it nice and simple, I don't want to put anything in there which not all policies in the market cover. So again, this is just a very general snapshot of what's commonly placed in cyber policies these days. So I found the best way to articulate cyber coverage is to show you how it would respond in action to a particular scenario. So I'll go over two scenarios, the first one being a data breach event and the second one being a network interruption type of event. So here's the deal for this one. An employee inadvertently clicks on a phishing email link and enters their login credentials, allowing an unknown third party or hacker a foothold into your server. So the hacker slowly makes their way through your network undetected and is able to view and steal personally identifiable information on thousands of individuals, which are then sold into the darknet for future extortion opportunities. A routine security audit of the network discovers this 6 months after the initial breach occurs. So luckily, you have a cyber insurance policy in place. Now, how would it respond? So cyber policies, again, essentially designed to broadly respond in a variety of ways to a cyber event. So just remember that root cause being the cyber event. But I felt that many clients and many organizations, or even colleagues, still often struggle to really understand how a policy actually plays out in practice. And usually you only find out at claims time how it really works. So to help you understand, I put together this timeline that I actually put together myself that I'm quite proud of. I don't really have a lot of paint skills or anything like that, so hopefully it makes sense. So it really serves as a good high-level visualization of how a cyber policy can respond to a data breach over time. So I just want to point out the fact that not all areas of this, all areas of coverage need to be triggered, but I will of course do so depending on the particular fallout and the particular severity of the root cause of the breach. But for the sake of this scenario, we'll assume it goes all the way until phase 3, so that's pretty severe. So I'll start with phase 1. This essentially is the immediate time period after you discover the data breach. So that's from the time you make your first phone call to the insurer or your incident response team, and really until you can figure out the true extent of the damage and really what needs to be done. So this will immediately trigger coverage for incident response management costs. So again, I said that's that really valuable part of the policy that's in no other type of insurance. So this includes access to a breach coach. So that's the triage team that coordinates really the entire incident response process from the get-go and really communicates with all parties involved. So obviously, when a cyber event happens, it can be pretty stressful. The fact that you've got people there who have dealt with these things before and can coordinate the response between the insurer, the broker, yourselves as the client, and of course, any other external parties that need to come in and talk to you and help out. You've got that essentially that one point of contact there, just triaging all of it. Secondly, you've got forensic investigation team. So these are the specialists that can come in and really determine first and foremost the extent of the breach. You've got access again, also to a public relations team. So that's becoming pretty important these days, and that's really to deal with any fallout or public communications that need to be required or a response to any media inquiries. I think there's a lot of interest in terms of privacy and data breaches or any sort of cyber events in the news these days. I pretty much see one about once a day now. So it's becoming pretty commonplace. And of course, you've also got access to legal advice if you need to as well. So this falls into the incident response category, especially if there is a lot of public interest involved from the get-go. So moving on to phase 2, assuming that the breach has affected thousands of individuals. So this begins the recovery phase, which can often take months to complete depending on the severity of the breach. So coverage can be triggered for data recovery or restoration if it's determined that the stolen data has also been corrupted or completely deleted from your systems. So the cost for external data restoration specialists, of course, will be covered, and just bearing in mind that this can cost a significant sum, especially if you don't have coverage. Secondly, you've got notification and regulatory costs as well, which are also covered, and that's really if it's determined that the data breach could be harmful to those individuals affected. So in the case of thousands of individuals having their information ending up on the dark web, that would most likely hit that threshold. So it can cost a lot of time and resources to prepare thousands of notifications for affected individuals, and as well as engaging with any necessary regulatory bodies, such as the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And again, this will become more of a factor next year once the privacy bill comes into play. So it's just good to know that's on the horizon. So moving on to phase 3, this could be well after the data breach, the original data breach event actually happens. So we're talking even years after, in which third-party liability claims or class actions could arise. So luckily, at this point anyway, we haven't really seen a lot of class actions in New Zealand for cyber events. We are starting to see those happening in the States, of course, and some in Australia. But again, with the new privacy legislation coming up, and again, and with that, public awareness and public interest, and just an overall sort of people valuing their privacy again, we might certainly see that happen, or definitely see a change in that landscape going forward. So of course, if anything does happen, there is of course coverage afforded for third-party privacy claims or class actions under a cyber policy, as well as the associated legal costs to defend it. And just that last point there at the bottom, ongoing monitoring for affected individuals, we can cover those costs as well. So this could be really the costs for any outsourced identity theft monitoring or credit card monitoring. They can often, carry out for 6 months to a year, depending again on the severity of the breach, and they can cost a little bit of money, especially if those individuals need someone to contact. So moving on to scenario 2, a cyber event that causes widespread network interruption. So completely different from a data breach this time. So in this situation, an overseas hacker group, I won't say from where, releases an aggressive ransomware code which targets and exploits vulnerabilities in the latest Windows operating system. So although you're not a direct target, the ransomware still finds its way into your operating network, locking 99% of all your systems and files in exchange for $500,000 of Bitcoin, causing significant disruption to multiple parts of your organization. Your organization is now in full crisis mode, with emails fully offline, local network drives being completely inaccessible, and businesses essentially at a complete standstill now. So in this case, how does your policy respond? In fact, it's pretty similar to the data breach event. As you can see, the timeline does look similar, but I'll still run through it all the same as there are some differences. So phase 1 is basically a carbon copy of the data breach response, especially in the immediate wake of the cyber event affecting your networks and systems. So again, just want to reiterate, so this is for the immediate incident response costs, which is unique to cyber coverage. So that's again, the breach counsel, forensic teams, PR teams, and of course, any legal advice. In addition to that, you've also got crisis negotiators as well for any sort of extortion type of events. So phase 2, the recovery phase. So this responds a little bit differently for network interruption. So here, first and foremost, you've got cover for cyber extortion. So that broadly responds to ransomware again, which causes any sort of disruption to your operations, as well as any sort of threats from hackers just to divulge stolen information, unless they're paid a sum of money. So yes, this does of course include ransom payments from the insurer if it's required to. However, the insurer will work really carefully with you and the crisis negotiators to really determine the best plan of action. At the end of the day, the insurers cannot tell you to pay a ransom. If you choose not to pay the ransom and want to spend the costs on recovery, they'll have to do that. And we are seeing this huge differences between the initial ransoms being something like $50,000 to the recovery being over 2 to 3 months and costing upwards of a few million. But again, the insurers will back you on that if they need to. So yeah, again, we're absolutely aware of the grey area as to whether you should be paying ransoms or not. So however, there's unfortunately no one size fits all. So I recommend just spending some time in the background before anything happens to determine what you should do or whether you would pay a ransom or not, or whether it's under a certain amount. So lastly, on phase 3, similar to before, so this provides cover for the tail end third-party liability risk, which could still arise from a interruption event. So that's really anyone who could, might be relying on the use of your networks. So we refer to this as network security liability. Again, this covers you for the legal defense costs as well as any sort of damages that might need to be paid out later on down the line. And just this last bit on the insurance side, I just want to debunk some cyber myths and really just set the record straight. I know there's quite a few misconceptions on insurance, on cyber insurance, which are still floating around. So a really common question we get asked is how cloud providers fit into all this. So simply put, coverage is generally provided to you under modern cyber insurance policies. And if they're not, then you definitely need to have a chat with your broker because it should become standard now, even if the disruption happened upstream to one of your cloud providers. You'll also be covered for any sort of liability for any sort of loss of data which is stored in the cloud. And obviously just because you store your data in the cloud doesn't mean that you're not on the line anymore if something does happen. At the end of the day, if your clients and customers are trusting you with that information, they don't care where you store it. For all intents and purposes, it is your responsibility to be looking after that information. But again, if anything does happen, you do have coverage for that. And insurers could then look to the cloud provider to recover any costs if need be later on down the line. Second point in the middle, of course, yes, human error is captured under modern policies, given the fact that staff are pretty much the root cause of about, I think, 70% of all breaches. We've seen policies pretty much respond to all claims, which a phishing link is the gateway really for hackers to get into the network. So again, that's just really being tested now. There's no sort of ambiguity as to whether that root cause being the phishing link is covered. That's absolutely under the scope these days. And lastly, reputational damage. Of course, that can't be fully prevented. If a cyber event happens and it makes the headlines, obviously there's always going to be a little bit of a reputational hit. I guess these days everyone's getting hit by them, so it might just be sort of lost amongst the noise. However, policies will still provide cover for public relations costs as well, so I just want to reiterate that to mitigate the damage of this. And some now even extend to cover loss specifically of loss of contracts if it can be attributed to adverse media coverage. So it's one of your key contracts pulls out because of cyber event making their headlines. There's some policies that respond to that these days. So yeah, really, I just wanted to touch upon a few of those points and just address those before we get to question time. I'm sure we'll still get some questions on that. So for the last part of my talk, I wanted to give you some tangible, practical steps to take away with you, to get your pens out. Whether you're thinking of transferring your risk over to an insurer or simply just to strengthen your own internal processes. So some really handy little tips. So just keep in mind that these tips are purely some suggestions to consider going forward, and are by no means a silver bullet or a foolproof plan to turn your organization into a fortress overnight, even though we'd like to have that. So just think about cyber maturity as a slow journey on a very slow Auckland motorway on a Friday afternoon and not an immediate destination. So firstly, accountability. You own it and you drive it as risk managers. So as risk managers, you can drive this more than you think you can, and essentially even more so than any other part of the business. Cyber risk is, of course, the way of the future. So simply just internalize that and add it to your tool belt. We really want to drive home the fact again that it is a business issue and not an IT issue. I can't stress that enough, guys. It's something that needs to be understood and driven from the risk management level and, of course, from the board level. So please don't leave this up to IT to tell you that everything is okay. They will always tell you that everything is okay. They're, of course, in charge of the digital perimeter, but it's up to you to work with the rest of the business to ensure that everyone knows how to keep the doors on lock. And, of course, get buy-in again from exec and board level. Obviously, nothing changes unless you get buy-in from them. Let them know that it's, again, ultimately their responsibility to make sure that all business risks are getting addressed, and that, of course, these days includes cyber. So onto cybersecurity. Yes, I thought I'd at least give some tips relevant to security. Again, without getting too technical, consider engaging an independent security audit or review. There are a wealth of cyber consultants these days in cyber consultancies that really specialize in these areas to have a look at everything from how your networks are set up to identifying vulnerabilities and how you can improve them accordingly. Secondly, understand your overall security strategy and roadmap over the next 5 years. So work with the business, work with your IT and internal security teams to understand what they currently have in place, what they've done to address any sort of issues, and of course, what they plan to do in the future. So often we see a massive disconnect between IT and the risk department. They often work in silos, so it's not out of the ordinary for that. But again, this really does need to change given the nature of the digital economy going forward. Just to add on that one though, just the third point to put in there, multi-factor authentication. If you write that down, multi-factor authentication these days is becoming something that insurers are really wanting to look at. If you have MFA controls in your organization, that can prevent a lot of these, especially those initial phishing links from spreading to wider parts of the organization. And of course, it would just prevent these things from happening altogether. So multi-factor authentication, bit of a buzzword. Cyber resiliency. So we're now seeing the need to move from a security-only focus, which has sort of been the traditional approach of the last sort of 20 years, to a resiliency focus. So in other words, assume that the worst is going to happen to your business and prepare for it accordingly. Run through it just like a fire drill. So there's no point locking the front door if you don't know what to do if someone enters your house. So working towards resiliency is all about constantly reviewing and testing your BCPs, so your business continuity plans, and of course your incident response plans or your IRPs. So make sure again that this is at the top of your mind going forward. Quick tip as well, a little insider secret: insurers again are really keen. So if you're looking at either reviewing your insurance policy, renewing your cyber insurance policy, or getting a new one in place, insurers will be looking at this this part here while they're underwriting your risk. So we do recommend being able to articulate what you have in terms of a business continuity plan. So yeah, really, there's an assumption these days that every business is bound to get hit eventually by a cyber event. Obviously, if you take out a policy, it's there to be used. So insurers will take plenty of comfort knowing that you have tested plans in place and that you can quickly recover from an event and mitigate the disruption as much as possible. So lastly, addressing the human element. So again, that's the weakest link in the cyber risk chain. First of all, have a look at your internal culture. Ask yourself, are people engaged with cybersecurity, and are they aware of the basics to protect themselves and of course the wider business? Do they even care about it? Culture is of course such a tricky thing to put your finger on and of course change, but it really shouldn't be overlooked even if it's a hard thing to do. Again, this is something that definitely needs governance and board buy-in to really have an impact. Secondly, explore the option of carrying out phishing simulations. So it's a really good way of building awareness amongst the organisation. And it's really to see how aware staff are about these very common threats. Again, there are a number of cyber consultancies these days that can come in and assist with carrying out authorised phishing exercises on your business, and it's often really fun or really terrifying to see what the results are. Lastly, consider providing training for staff in terms of their personal security. So that's completely different from the business side of things. So that's their personal devices and their personal online accounts. So that's starting to become a really good approach for protecting the wider business. The thought behind that is if you can train your staff to have their personal security hygiene up to standard, and there's no difference between work and home, then it'll just really, really flow on to protect the organization really from a grassroots level. So just to wrap up, if you take anything away from today's session, I know I've tried to cover a lot of ground in the last 40 minutes. Cyber events are becoming more frequent and showing no signs of slowing down, so you just can't ignore it anymore. Understand, measure, and manage your cyber risk. So again, that's the 3-pillar framework that we have. It's nice and easy to remember. Cyber insurance is being tested and responding really well to cyber events in the broadest sense these days, and it's really now showing its value to those who have it. And lastly, take ownership of cyber risk as risk managers in your organization. Don't leave it up to IT to handle, and start slowly implementing some of these changes into your business over time to really get some change. So more than anything, I hope that today's session has at least debunked a few cyber myths for you, if you will, and that you have at least a bit more clarity on how to start tackling it going forward. So just before we start our Q&A session, I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. So this is a quote from Brittany Kaiser, who was a former director at Cambridge Analytica, who I'm sure everyone is now familiar with after the infamous Facebook data scandal, or have watched The Great Hack on Netflix. So Brittany Kaiser stated that data has now surpassed oil as the most valuable asset on Earth, which I somewhat agree with. So the fact that Cambridge Analytica was so easily able to allegedly swing Brexit and the 2016 US election using key data points on targeted individual citizens who are deemed persuadable shows the sheer power of big data. So data by itself poses no threat, but has the ability to be abused, misused, weaponized, and now even threaten our democratic processes. So I challenge anyone who still thinks that their data is completely uninteresting and not valuable to anyone to think long and hard again about the world that you now live in. So thank you all again for having me here today. I'll now open the floor for some questions.
Thank you very much, Jono, for that comprehensive presentation. We have a couple of questions coming through the webinar, so we'll kick off with those. The first question from a remote participant is, if response coach's instructions are not followed, does that compromise cover?
So if you have a policy in place, so these days, first and foremost, it's good to outline the insurance part of the process as part of your incident response process. So obviously, if you follow those protocols and essentially following what the insurers have laid out, and these days most insurers should have a really an 0800 number or a hotline to call 24/7. Obviously, given the nature of cyber events being at any time of the day, if you follow those guidelines, really, that incident response team or that response manager, they'll advise you really the best thing. So that, if you're following those protocols, it's not going to compromise any cover whatsoever. Just want to add on as well that generally that part of the cover doesn't have an excess attached to it. So you don't have to start thinking, or start trying to quantify the loss yourselves before you actually get to that point. They want you to engage really with the coverage and to trigger that coverage as soon as you can. Obviously, if you go down the route of trying to fix everything yourselves and only notifying the insurer at the very end of it after racking up a few $1 million, and not keeping them in the loop, then obviously, just like any other insurance, you could get compromised. So if you do have a policy in place, just make sure that you're working with the insurer and with your immediate response.
Thank you. We have another question from Christchurch this time. Are there different excesses depending on the type of attack? And is there a limit on accepted claims per year?
So I'll start with the excesses. That really depends on your policy. So some would obviously have different excesses Again, as I said, the incident response side of things generally have a nil excess. If they do have an excess on that these days, make sure you get that changed. Again, that's becoming standard as part of modern cyber risk. Other excesses, again, that just really depends on the particular policy, so I won't be able to comment on that. For limits, generally there is an aggregate limit on a policy, so that would generally be for the calendar year or for any one claim, and again that depends on the specific wording, on the specific setup of your policy. Again, just like any other coverages, but of course there are certain sublimits on certain sections of coverage. For example, cybercrime or social engineering, which we're now seeing creeping in from crime policies into cyber policies. They're generally capped at most at about 250,000 at this point, and that's really just because the losses could be massive, and we don't want those massive losses starting to erode the cyber market. So again, just it really depends on the real nuances of your specific policies.
Thank you, Jono. Those were the 2 questions from our webinar platform. Everybody at the venues and our remote participants, please feel free to type in questions at any point. But while we are waiting for more, I'm happy to open it up for the Auckland audience. Yes, Cecilia, go on.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation.
No problems.
We made a reference to the upcoming legislation on a privacy bill.
Yep.
I was just making a comparison with the health and safety legislation in terms of the ability to insure against fines and penalties from a data breach under the new bill. Of course, we don't know what it's going to ultimately look like, but currently under the Health and Safety Act, we cannot insure against what is not going to respond to it.
Yeah.
So just curious, of course, you can for legal defense and for reparation for health and safety. Question, what do you think, how the new bill might impact on the insurability of fines and penalties under the new, proposed new bill?
Yep. So I'll start with the fines, but so at the moment it's looking at about $10,000, which is like, even it's really low. Even the Privacy Commissioner said it's really low. But from a coverage perspective, there are clauses in there to say that we are offering coverage for fines and penalties, from a regulatory angle, depending on the legal insurability of it. So that's sort of that clause there. So we really won't know. Even there's a lot of chat these days, not from a New Zealand perspective yet, but looking just at the GDPR in Europe and obviously Australia, and even in the States, the big question is, are GDPR fines even insurable? And it really depends on the jurisdiction in which it's for. I think there's only one jurisdiction in Europe, which might be like, I think Estonia, out of all the EU countries, that actually allow you to pay for those fines. But at the moment, it's saying that everything else is not covered. But from an insurance angle, those provisions are there. So I guess from a New Zealand perspective, we won't really know until then. But I don't think that the fines. After hearing a few talks from the privacy commissioners, they're not wanting to lead with sort of the stick. They want to make everyone sort of compliant from a, from a preventative angle, first and foremost. So yeah.
Amit, did you have one?
Yes, just a quick one. John, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, no problem.
I enjoyed it. I'm from Auckland Council, and one question I have is that as you know, that there are small, medium, and large size of organizations, and I've come across some that are really large, and they have systems and infrastructure in place that they believe they are secure enough to not either purchase cyber cover, or they think that they don't need to buy the extensive cover, comprehensive cover that might be available there. Given that you've stated that the state of the industry is still in its adolescence and it's still sort of developing, is there work that insurers are doing to make it a little bit more consistent for, I guess, large, medium, or small organizations to sort of fit into what they might want based on the maturity level they might be at?
Sure.
Like, what work is going on from the industry side?
Yep.
To sort of, I guess, meet that customer expectation, because you hear varied opinions depending on who you talk to.
Absolutely. Yeah, so from an insurer perspective, these days they're offering so much more than just coverage first and foremost. So they want to obviously it started from that anyway. I don't know if you sort of wind back about 5 years, it was really hard to even get insurance just because the maturity of businesses it just wasn't there. So these days there's a lot of bells and whistles that are offered with policies. So especially at the larger end, sort of the high corporate end, a lot of policies do sort of say, look, we'll offer you pre-loss services. So again, you can get a consultancy in to review what's going on and to help you sort of beef up your maturity. So everything that I sort of talked about today, you can get that those services really either paid for fully or subsidized. So that really works best for everyone involved, the client, the insurer, brokers, to understand what's going on, and again, just to prevent things from happening altogether. So that's really at sort of a higher end point of view. From the small to medium side, and this is probably the biggest challenge, because if SMEs get hit, they're not going to have a lot of resources to tap into. So from my perspective, I think there is a huge value in SMEs actually really taken up cyber. So you actually, for them, transferring most of that risk and being able to engage again with that incident response plan and all these external vendors and all these parts of the coverage, which just won't be available to them or would cost a lot of money to fork out themselves. Just to add on for, I guess the larger end corporates in terms of coverage, we are seeing these days, or we're recommending that they start looking at catastrophic loss. So that's not them getting a $2 million or $5 million coverage. That's just kind of pointless. Depending on the size of the organization, we recently placed $100 million for a business in New Zealand, which is one of the bigger towers in New Zealand at this point, and that's really in the worst case scenario if something happened. So before you even get to there, I really recommend the quantification side of things is really important to really, if you want to get your level of coverage at that top level and have a high excess as well. So it's really for the catastrophic side. Good. Tama.
Hey, Jono. So with the privacy law reforms, is that kind of signaling mandatory notification for breaches in New Zealand?
100%, absolutely. So the briefings that we've had, again, so even if you go online, they'll say this, I think they've passed the second reading in Parliament. So yeah, they say mandatory notifications, it's 99% guaranteed it's going to happen.
And the current landscape is optional.
Absolutely, yeah. So at the current landscape, if you lose thousands of people's data, you don't have to tell them. You don't have to tell them, or you don't have to tell the regulator, which I think is it's very outdated, considering the fact that the Privacy Act is from 1993. So they said the Jurassic Park era. Kind of, because that's when the movie came out. So yeah, we're living on Jurassic Park era privacy law at the moment, and obviously that will change. It will come in line with GDPR and Australian entity.
Awesome. And just a second question, in terms of silent cyber or the non-affirmative cyber, you're seeing Lloyd's and Allianz explicitly state cyber coverage in their traditional policies. What are the other insurers doing around that? Are you seeing them change their strategy for silent cyber?
Not just yet. I knew you were going to bring that up. Silent cyber. So yeah, obviously Allianz being the first to do that last year, and obviously Lloyd's of London now. So just give you also background if you don't know what silent cyber is. It's really coverage which was afforded under old traditional property policies or any other non-cyber properties which silently covered cyber without them really intending to. So a good example of this is actually the Mondelez case from NotPetya, I think, which has made the headlines a lot. And again, just to set the record straight on that one. So there's a lot of misinformation about that one going around saying that cyber did not respond. The cyber insurance policy did not respond to Mondelez because the insurer Zurich, I can say that because all public knowledge, triggered the war and terror exclusion. And that was under the property policy. So it's not, they didn't even have a cyber policy in place. If they had a cyber policy in place, that would have been explicitly covered, again, because it's a cyber event. So this again ties back to what I was saying about not relying on other, forms of coverage, trying to respond to that. And the reason why they had to, that Zurich had to trigger that war exclusion under their property policy was because it was silently covered under there, and it was really their only way to get out of it. Again, there's a lot of debate around the area from an industry perspective, and it'd be really interesting to see what the ruling is on that, because it's all in court at the moment. But just going forward on that, no, we haven't seen any sort of progress yet, but we will be seeing some more clarity really as to what sort of losses will be under what sort of policies. 100%.
Any other questions from Auckland?
I have one, Anne from the Auckland Council. So we all know that the small, medium enterprise section gets impacted most when it comes to losses. And it's quite broad, but what are you generally seeing in terms of claims payment with respect to the claims ratio? What's the ratio?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of claims getting paid out,
yeah,
pretty much 100% at the moment. Yeah, it's really good. Really, really good. So again, if it is a cyber event, we are seeing that responding. So it's a really good thing. Obviously, the grey area stuff like social engineering. So that's that invoice fraud, which everyone is now talking about, because it's quite a big concern from a monetary perspective of an organisation. So we're seeing a lot of those in terms of claims frequencies. If there is a provision under the cyber policy for that, again, it's being triggered. If it's covered under the crime, that's being triggered under there. So, but just in a nutshell, if it's a cyber event, it's being triggered. There's nothing really.
Came from a banking background,
Yeah.
and what we found that the small SME customers were telling us was that the insurer would first say go after the banks.
Okay,
pockets.
sure.
So they sort of struggle between an outcome.
Yeah. Now, obviously, stuff like that loss first. If the banks can recover that funds, then again, it's a win for everyone. But obviously, once that money goes offshore, it's really hard. And the insurer, again, if you have that coverage under that provision under your policy, then it will pick up there. So I know there's probably a lot of talk about exclusions or a lot of concerns about having a policy in place and it not triggering. But again, in a nutshell, if it's a cyber event, and it will respond again to how I demonstrated that out there. 100%.
Sorry.
That would be our final question. Yes.
Just picking up from your point earlier, do you think there is sufficient players in the market for cyber insurance locally?
At the moment, yes. So it's still what we're calling a buyer's market. So premiums have been pretty flat for the last sort of 3 years. It's still there. So if you're thinking about buying a policy, it's a good time now. There is plenty of capacity as well. So at any one carrier usually caps out at about 10 million, but of course you can start building that on top of each other. So there's still plenty of appetite, plenty of capacity in the market. And obviously you can go overseas as well for cyber.
Sorry, I wasn't under that impression. I thought there were only limited players in the cyber market, which means that obviously with many claims, what's going to happen next year is your premiums are down to
Sure.
to reflect the number of claims.
Absolutely. So interesting to say. No, it's at this point anyway. I guess what we're seeing are still lots of losses, but also lots of uninsured losses. So it's not impacting the premium pool as such. What we are seeing though are insurers again becoming a bit more cautious of what risks they are taking on. So there is capacity and there is appetite, but insurers again they're wanting to make sure that the risks that they are taking on are good risks, and that again you've got those business continuity plans in place. So they're not looking at blowing out full losses. I think that the biggest claim we've probably had in New Zealand is probably about 3 to 4 million this year, and that was just on recovery. It's for a big outdoor sports retailer.
Can you name a few players? I don't know why AIG.
Yep, 100%. AIG, Chubb. So these are the global ones. Zurich. So these are the big players at the big corporate end. Berkshire Hathaway, and locally we've got NZI, Delta Insurance, I think it's Vero. So there's about a good sort of 7 or 8 markets that we go to on a daily basis. And of course, if there's anything sort of at a more complex risk, we can build that capacity overseas. So there's no problem with that these days.
Yeah. Let's conclude those questions in Auckland. John is going to be here in a little while, so you always get a chance to speak to him. We have one question from a remote participant, and that will be the final one that we'll take today. And that one is, are insurers likely to insist on clients complying with security standards, example, getting some sort of certification And if not now, it's that likely in the future?
So at this case, no, they want to make, again, if they're satisfied with your basic sort of levels of security and your basic hygiene, then they'll be happy to generally write your policy, again, depending on sort of the industry or the nature of your specific risk. Just want to put that as a disclaimer. In terms of having an actual framework, an actual standard, we haven't seen anything like that at the moment, but of course, things might change in the future, and it's probably not a bad idea. Obviously, there'll be a bit more work for everyone, but from a preventative point of view, that could be good. But nothing to indicate that at this stage.
Thank you, Jono. With that, I would like to bring today's seminar to a conclusion. Thank you once again for that really insightful presentation. I took a whole lot of notes, and I did see a whole lot of people taking notes, and I get the feeling we can be sitting here talking on this for quite a while, which is a good way to end the seminar. Thank you, everyone, for making the time to join us at November's Lunchtime Seminar. A big shout out once again to our partners who make all of our activities at RiskNZ possible. Our Premier and Platinum partners, Marsh, SAI Global, and Paladin, our Lunchtime Seminar partners, Cybercraft and Safety Associates, and all our venues across the country, KPMG, Watercare, Navigators, Christchurch City Council, and PowerCo. Thank you. And thank you all once again for being here. And I look forward to hosting you all again in more RiskNZ activities in 2020. Thank you, everyone.